Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. I got a suggestion in the comments for a mod tip video that was brilliant, and I decided it had to be the one that was going to happen today, so the soldering one will be delayed a little bit. But somebody asked if I could do a Monday mod tip on beginning modder toolkit. And I thought that was a brilliant idea. So this is obviously a little bit beyond beginner, but we're going to start with the simplest and move up. So the very simplest mod that you can really do to any blaster is to double the spring. So if you have two of the same blaster, you can take the spring out of one and put it in the other, or if you have extra springs that came from other places, you can generally do that. Some blasters you can literally just double the spring up and it can still get enough compression. If it won't get enough compression, you need a spring that's either a little bit smaller diameter or larger diameter so they will properly nest. And to do that simplest mod, really all you're going to need is a screwdriver in order to open up the blaster. And while the size of the screws and the size of the screw holes varies from blaster to blaster, which is somewhat annoying. It'd be nice if they could come up with a standard, but even the holes will even vary within the same blaster sometimes. But typically, a lot of blasters you can get away with a #1 Phillips, which is fairly common in any screwdriver set you're going to get. You're probably going to get one of these. If this proves to be too big, which it does occasionally, you can go down to a #0 Phillips, or get, precision screwdriver sets. But these are the ones that I use the most often. I have a bit, it's a #1 bit that fits on either my drill or my electric screwdriver. I have a slightly smaller one, and then this one is more or less the same. In fact, it is the same. So you're going to want to start with a good screwdriver set. And I recommend actually getting a set, because you will need flathead screwdrivers more often than you would expect. They come in very handy. So a good set of screwdrivers is highly recommended, and make sure it has a #1, and you're probably going to need a set that has a 0 or something in between. It will vary from blaster to blaster. The next thing that I highly recommend is a good pair of needle nose pliers. They are also something that I use in most of my builds at least once. So a good heavy set of needle nose pliers. They also have cutters on them, which can be used for wire cutting as well as for spring cutting. If it's a weaker spring, a thinner spring, you can sometimes get away with that. If that proves insufficient for cutting the spring, then you can go up to actual side cutters, or the big wire cutters, generally used for, doing... I use it mostly for cutting rings for chainmail. They use it in fencing, a lot of other things that use a thicker gauge wire. These work very well. They can also be used for cutting the shell. I understand that Mr. Nathan actually tends to use a very small set of these for trimming away shell, because it's very, very precise, which is handy. And either of these will cut fairly heavy springs. They will cut K26, but it's a lot more difficult. If you want to cut K26, I recommend either going to the Dremel, a hacksaw, or my personal favorite, bolt cutters. The only thing I ever really use bolt cutters for in Nerf is for cutting K26. I will occasionally use it for cutting things that I'm using as rivets, because that works fairly well also. But typically I'm using it for that. I will occasionally also cut bolts with it, what with being bolt cutters. But that's a fairly specialized item and doesn't come up all that often. But from there, if you start doing any kind of shell work, you're definitely going to want a pen and a pencil. I like a fine tip Sharpie, retractable one, for doing marks, because it's much more precise, obviously. And being retractable, it doesn't dry out if you forget to put the cap back on. Pencil is also good. It will draw on Nerf plastic fairly well and isn't permanent. You can then smudge it back off, rather than a permanent marker obviously isn't going to come off. Next up, I have files. You should definitely have a good set of files, absolutely necessary for either spring work or shell work, to clean up the end of the spring, as well as cleaning up shells. I use a round file for boring out barrels that I'm putting brass barrels in. I use diamond headed for doing much more precise work, especially if I'm doing curves. I've got this, it's flat on one side, curved on the other. Very useful for a lot of things. And then I have a very triangular one that has more than a 90-degree angle on it, which allows you to get in and create sharp corners for any number of application. For taking the pins out of things, like on bolt sleds, I use a center punch. You just need some sort of a light hammer. I recommend also getting a rubber mallet of some kind for if you're going to be doing any kind of hammering. You don't want to use a metal one because it'll mar things more. But you can use this to pound out pegs, and it's very handy. You can also use it to put them back in. I also highly recommend having a good razor blade or X-Acto knife set. Both, there's lots of different uses for them. For cutting foam, for cutting actual plastic, you can use it to shave down things. I'll often have to shave down the spring, the catch spring post that the catch spring locks onto, because number 55 is much stronger, but is also a lot smaller than some Nerf catch springs. So I have to shave down that post a little bit, and the razor blade works best for that. I also use it for cutting stencils and for scraping off any number of things that I don't want on, scraping off decals, scraping off, you know, cutting off pegs and stuff. Good idea to have one of those. I also recommend a good heavy pair of scissors. Again, good for cutting foam, occasionally for cutting shells, but mostly I use this one for cutting foam. But if you really want a good pair of scissors, I recommend cast cutters, or what I know them as, because that's what they use them for in the hospital. They are heavy duty, cheap, easy to get a hold of, and they actually have a serrated blade, which means they will cut just about everything. I cut everything from leather, plastic. I'll use this to cut brass. I'll use it to cut roofing tin. I use it to cut all kinds of materials because these things are indestructible and will cut just about anything. Hacksaw is very useful. You can use it for cutting shells if you don't have any kind of a power saw. Hacksaws are also cheap and easy to get a hold of. Any hardware store is going to have them. They're not very expensive. The blades are replaceable, so when they wear out, you can get new ones. You can use them to cut springs, but I don't recommend it. But they are very good for cutting shells if you have the patience and don't rush it. Go nice and slow so that the blade doesn't deviate off the course that you want. I also highly recommend getting a drill. A drill is something you're definitely going to need at some point. It doesn't necessarily need to be cordless, but a drill is useful. You can use it for taking screws out. I don't recommend using it to put the screws back in because it has too much torque and will strip out the screw posts. But taking it out is fine. For putting it back in, I recommend doing it by hand, just because you don't want to strip out your screw heads. So you're also going to need to drill all kinds of things in the course of modding. Drilling new screw holes, drilling new pin supports, all sorts of things you can use a drill for. You can, in fact, use it for cutting shell work. If you drill numerous holes and then work your way between them, it can be done. A good drill is a good idea. I also finally picked up a cordless screwdriver. It has a lot less torque than the drill, so I'm not as worried about it stripping things out when I put things back in and taking them out. Not a necessary one, but definitely very, very handy. Once you get past a certain point in modding, you are going to pretty much have to have a Dremel of one variety or another. I have my big one with the heavy torque for grinding that is now suspended from my ceiling and has a foot pedal. Those are magnificent and gorgeous, and I highly recommend them, but they're a little bit more expensive. You can get a fairly decent Dremel for not too much, and if you get all of the necessary bits for it, it is the most versatile tool you'll probably ever own. You can use it for cutting, you can use it for grinding, you can use it for drilling. It is a beautiful, beautiful tool. There are lots and lots of attachments. The ones that I recommend the most, of course, are drill bits, cutting discs, sanding wheels, and grinding bits, which is what I have on the one from my ceiling. It is absolutely magnificent for so many things. And the one that's hanging from my ceiling is lower RPM than this one, which means it doesn't melt the plastic as you grind it, which is also why I really like this. It's really good for cutting away lots of plastic really quickly. Once you've gotten things apart, you're going to need things to put them back together, and the ones that I use the most commonly are screws. I really prefer to use screws. I'll take a piece of plastic and glue it to the back side of the two shells that I'm putting together, and then drill holes through the shell and in through the support and screw it together. It is far less likely to come apart and when you don't want it to, but you can take the screw out and then it will come apart when you want it to. So that's what I favor in a lot of my builds. I pretty much only use epoxy to fill in gaps. I rarely use epoxy for structural, but it works. Most people do, many people do, and it works very, very well. I just prefer to have some more physical stuff in there as well. I also very much recommend Gorilla Glue. I like the super glue gel that they have because it's not as runny and doesn't end up getting places you don't want it to. And it will bond most things together, and many things it will bond practically instantly, so you need to be careful. Other things you have to hold it until it sets. And last but not least, a glue gun. I, for a long time, for some reason, felt that using a glue gun in Nerf modding was somehow wrong or bad, or I have no explanation for that, because now I know that it is one of the most useful tools that you will ever own, especially once you get into flywheels and all of that, because it works really, really well, and it isn't terribly permanent. It will not come off when you don't want it to, but you can get it off once you do want it to. And I recommend getting a high temp glue gun. That's what this one is. It takes a lot more heat to actually melt the plastic, which is good if you're going to be doing things like gluing motors in, because the motors will heat up, and if you use a low temp glue, it will actually melt the glue, and then bad things will happen. So I favor a high temp glue gun, and use it liberally. Glue is cheap, and if you screw up, you can always pull it off and try again, but it will generally hold very, very well. I use it for gluing in switches most commonly, is what I'm most commonly going to be using hot glue for, is gluing the switches in flywheel blasters, and it's just so much easier and more reliable than trying to use super glue, which can crack, and epoxy, which is also slightly more difficult to work with. Hot glue works magnificently for that sort of application in my experience. So I think that covers all of the basic tools that I use for simpler modifications. Primarily, these are the tools that I would recommend building towards. Start with the screwdrivers, start with the pliers, start with the cutters, the simple things that you can get. Most of what is here, in fact, I think everything that is here can be gotten at a well-stocked hardware store, which, Home Depot should have pretty much everything that I have on this table. So there's nothing weird or exotic that you're going to need to go online for if you don't have that as an option. You can obviously you can find any of this stuff online, and you can find it online really, really cheap. So that is my recommendation for a beginning modder's toolkit. Once you have the funds, you can of course move up to bigger power tools and bench power tools and all of that. But this is the stuff that I would put into a bag if I were going to a mod party at somebody else's. In fact, I have. These are the tools that I put in my bag when I go to mod parties at, like, Wacom's place. Because these are the things that I know I'm going to need. No matter what mod I'm doing, I'm going to need at least one of these tools. And for a lot of mods, I will end up using all of these tools. So that is my recommendation for a beginning modder toolkit, the things that you should look for and start building towards having. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, things you feel that I have horrifically omitted, go ahead and put that in the comments section below. I hope this was helpful, and thank you for watching.